Hello and welcome to another KeySmash Studios video. In this video, we're going to be talking about the process of doing art for a 3D object. As you can see in the scene in front of me, one of our members has created a 3D object for me to art. There are several different parts to this. It is a larger chimney, but we have individual bricks as well as mortar and then a top. To do art for a 3D model that is a higher poly model, much like this one, we need to make sure that the art itself has some textures in it. With that in mind, we're going to create a UV, add some colors and some textures, and see what we can get. First things first, I like to keep Blender in a pretty standard default settings. I don't try to change it too much away from what you might open when you see it. So when you have a 3D object that's in object mode, we're going to come down here to edit mode. What we're going to do to make a UV is select the entirety of the object. To do this, we simply hit A, and it will select every edge, every face, and every vertex in the object. Then, hovering over the object, we're going to hit U. This is the shortcut for UV mapping. And we can do an unwrap, but it's somewhat unnecessary on an object that is largely square, much like this one. So we're going to hit Smart UV Project. And it opens up this window. What we're going to do is create some margins on our UV and put a little bit of weight on it. And just hit OK. It seems like nothing has happened, but if we go to our UV image editor, we can see that we have a bunch of different squares here. Now, if we click this little thing in the top right and drag it over, we can create a sort of second window. If we go back to our 3D view in that second window, we can see that individual faces make up all of these faces on the UV. This is going to be incredibly useful to us, as we need to know which faces are things like the individual bricks, or the mortar, or even the top of the chimney. So what we need to do is export this UV into something that we can use. We've selected every face. We're going to go over here to where it says UVs, and we're going to hit Export UV Layout. Once we've done that, we're going to set our size of the UV layout down here. So here, I actually want to make this a 4K texture file. So 4096 by 4096 is the correct size for a 4K texture. I'm going to save it as a PNG, and we're going to hit Export Layout. Then, in our favorite photo editing software of your choice, it can be GIMP, it can be Photoshop, it can be Paint.net, just something that you can edit the PNG with. We're going to go open that same file. Once we've opened this file, it does not actually look like much has happened. But if we zoom in Photoshop, we can see that the individual faces are still here. Now this is an unnecessary step, but it is one that I like to do, as it just helps me see just a little bit better. The first thing I do is I switch to a black, and I give myself a background to work with the UVs. I'm going to merge these layers just so it's one continuous layer where I have individual squares that I can easily select with the wand tool. As I said before, there are two things that we're trying to do here. The first is to give color to our model, and we can do that fairly easily. We know that most of these squares are going to be the type of color that lines up with brick. So if I come to my color swatch and I select some type of like orangish brown, something on par with a brick, maybe let's get a little more red in there. And I'm going to make a new layer, and underneath it, I'm just going to paste this brick color. I want to be doing my editing for the colors on a different layer than the initial layer that matches up with the actual UV. And the reason for that is we don't actually want these squares on our UV. Otherwise, they will show up as a part of the color scheme. So now that we have the natural-ish color for our brick, we need to find out some type of natural-ish color for the grit that goes in between the bricks. And typically speaking, on a chimney, that's something that is a little bit off yellow and orange, but closer to the side of white. So we need to find out where the faces are that match up with where the grit is on the 3D model. So we just need to select the inside faces here and see where they are. We see that they're over here on the UV where there's 4 in a row. The only additions that I want to actually make to this is to select the bottom of that and then come up here and select the top. Additionally, I want to make sure that I get the 4 sides at the top as well as the overhang that's underneath them. These are all of the places on the image where I actually want to have a different color separate from the brick color. So if we go back to Photoshop, these line up with places on our first color that we can select. So we have our top, our bottom, the 4 sides of our square. Additionally, we want these 4 swatches of color here. And we'll just go back to Blender just to double check. See, we've forgotten 1 square here. It's okay. What I want to do is I just want to zoom in just a little bit. I'm going to make sure that I got every part of the UVs I want. So now, on yet another layer, but on top of the brick layer, I'm going to find a type of grit color that I think matches what is the real world color, and I'm going to paste it on these. And you see when I take away this top layer, we can see that we have an image that looks a little weird, but we can see what this does when we put it on our model in Blender. So I'm just going to save this as a PNG. Once I've done that, I can go into Blender, and we're going to go back out of edit mode to our object. On the left side, we're going to come to our node editor. We're going to make sure that we're in cycles render, and we're going to create a new material for this chimney. Over here, we're going to put an image texture. That's Shift A to open up this window here. So Shift A, texture, image texture. We're going to drag the color in, and we're going to open up our chimney test just to see how the colors look. Doesn't look like much changed, but that's because it doesn't natively show the material in the viewport. So if we come down here, right next to where you switch modes, click this dot, and you can switch it to show the material. And we can see that we did a pretty good job selecting what faces we needed. I can't see anywhere where there are wrong faces. I'm purposely not focusing on the bottom because this model will eventually go into a house, and I don't particularly care what the bottom of the model looks like because it won't be seen by a player in a game. But as I said, there's 2 parts to what we're trying to do here. The first part is getting these colors correct. I'm reasonably happy with these colors. I might change the color of just the brick just a little bit to make it a little bit darker. Perhaps that's not even quite right. Make it just a little more vividly dark, but still like a brick. But I'm generally happy with how these colors turned out. The last step that we need to do is to talk about materials. So I went to Google and making sure I have checked the reuse for modification or labeled for reuse. I searched for 4K materials and I found one of sand, and that's what I'm going to use as a base material for the grit. And I found one of cement because while it's true, I can look up brick here. I don't actually want any of the parts in between the bricks. I just want the material that makes up the brick itself. And I find that generally cement looks a little closer to that than finding a random picture that's 4K of just an individual brick. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy these images and we're going to put them into a new document in Photoshop. And all that we're going to do is we're going to go up here to Image, Adjustments, and we're going to hit black and white. Because we don't actually want them to have color. We just want the way that it looks. We just want the material look of it. Once we've done that, then we can copy it. We're going to come back here. So our brick here, we're on this second layer. We're going to create a layer above it. I'm sorry, a layer below it. And we're going to paste. Now this is a pretty neat trick in Photoshop once we do it. But I'm just going to resize this a little bit because I don't actually care if it's stretched weird or not. I just want it to match up and have some type of textury feel on the brick. Naturally, when I cover up this layer of cement texture, I can't actually see it. But if instead of the normal here, I click the multiply, we can see that it multiplies the layer below it, or all layers below it, and brings out some of the details of the textures here. So now we have this brick color, and we can change this by with opacity, adding the amount of color that we want on the layer that is the multiply, and we can have this really cool thing where we have this texture, but it's also a color. And we're going to do the same exact thing with the sand. Now it doesn't typically work as well with lighter textures, so we'll have to see. So again, I create a new image, I paste, image, adjustments, and we're just going to hit black and white because we just want the detail. So for this grit, I just need it to match up only behind where the grit is and not on top of the brick. The one little trick is to select all of the area that's not grit. I'm on the grit layer. I'm selecting all of the area. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-I to select the inverse. Now I've only selected where the grit is on the picture. And I'm going to do two things. So first, where I have the grit selected, I'm going to delete the color. And I'm going to delete the cement material because I don't want either of those bleeding into where I have grit. Then I'm going to press Control-Shift-I again to go to the inverse of the grit. And I'm going to delete everywhere where there isn't grit. So now I have an image where there's nothing underneath this sand material and this color. So again, I come here and I hit multiply, and I can change the color of this as much as I want to. So we can see that multiply doesn't work quite as well as we'd hoped. we're going to go back to normal, and rather than just do multiply because it's a lighter color, we're just going to pull back on the opacity until we can see a little bit of the sand, but a lot of the color. So now we have a little bit more of a bizarre picture, but that's okay. We're going to save this as chimney test 2 and see what it looks like on our model. Now that it's done saving, we can go back to Blender. Select chimney test 2, and when we put it on our thing, we actually see that while it's true we have colors, we now have a little bit more detail than the colors. Now this is only one step of all the parts to making a 3D model. We've made the colors and the color material of our 3D model. Eventually we'll make a normal map for this so we can just slap it on a cube that has 6 faces. That way it's much less intensive for the CPU to render. We'll also add a height map, and if it's something that could potentially have fire coming out of the top, we'll add an emissive map, which is where it shows where the colors glow. So we might want a flame coming out of the top of a chimney, and we'd want a red glow coming out. We can also have a height map, which will help us improve the sight lines on a flat object that shows the variance of depth in areas where the bricks come out and the grit recedes from the edge of the model. Because our eventual goal here is to have a 12 polygon model that has all of this information on it and is really easy for the computer to render. Thank you so much for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, all that jazz, and we'll see you next week.